What happens when the universe's most relentless demon killer is dropped into the galaxy that breeds them by the trillion? Today we throw the Doomslayer into Warhammer 40,000, where the warp has a name, the Imperium has a heresy for everything, and mercy is extinct. No law lawyering, just a fast, feral what-if that asks, does he become the Imperium's deadliest secret, or Chaos's favorite challenge? The warp did not open so much as it peeled, like wet paint coming off a cathedral wall. It left behind a rip in reality no bigger than a manufactorum freight door, shedding sparks of unality that burned holes through prayer flags and hazard sigils alike. Pilgrims knelt because they didn't have anything else to do. Guardsmen didn't kneel because their sergeants were still alive. From the wound stepped a figure that wasn't on any regimental slate, not in any saint's mural, not in any monster compendium carried by the Order. Just a man-shaped slab of intent in green plate, heavy enough to make adamantine flooring confess beneath his boots. The world smelled like promethium and fear. Larspax crackled, the Vox screamed with Litany 9, and above all of it was the thunder of wings and the butcher's laughter of a bloodthirster carving the river of men into tributaries. The Doomslayer didn't look up when the greater demon roared. He moved. The first thing to die was a chain axe man, twice the height of a man, neck opened with a twist of the wrist and a burst of red that steamed on the cold hive wind. The next was a pack of bloodletters that tried to fold around him like a closing book. He wrote in them with a super shotgun until there were no pages left. He headbutted a horned face into paste, chainsawed through a brass spine that rang like a church bell, and used a dying demon's body as a ladder to vault into the throat of another. Guardsmen stopped shooting not because they ran out of targets, but because they ran out of understanding. They had seen bayonet charges break, commissars burn, penitent engines fail to find penance. They had not seen a thing that refused to negotiate with physics. The bloodthirster finally noticed the insult to its artistry and came down like a falling tower, whip cracking with a noise that tried to be language. The Doomslayer slid under it, boots scoring the decking, and popped a grenade into a mouthful of iron fangs as he went. The explosion tore a laugh into a scream. He answered with the crucible, an edge of impossible red that extended from a hilt like a verdict, drawing it across the world the way a scribe draws a line through a lie. The demon's guard came late. The edge didn't. Brass met unmaking and found it had nothing to trade. Khorne's champion was not a duelist, so much as a meteor, and he treated the ground accordingly. Each hammer blow turned a platoon's line into a crater and filled it with exhaust and prayer. The Doomslayer turned those craters into stepping stones. He fought inside the demon's reach, where the whip had to retract and the axe had to consider the shape of its swing, where a knee could be broken and a rib could be discovered and corrected. When the beast tried to throw him with a lash of the barbed chain, he used the pull to launch himself upward, hit the creature's collarbone with a double blast that powdered rune-etched metal, and stuck the crucible down to the hilt like he was pinning an insect sample to a board. The warp shuddered. The bloodthirster tried to disentangle itself from existence by unmaking everything nearby. But the Doomslayer had learned the tempo of oblivion a very long time ago. He carved through the beating furnace of the demon's chest, put one boot to its sternum, and rode it to the deck plating. It writhed, and then it stopped, not banished in a polite plume of ether, but ended. The sudden absence made the storm hesitate, as if surprised to be without its favorite toy. Silence in war isn't the absence of noise. It's the feeling when the noise realizes you aren't listening to it anymore. Vox traffic stumbled, then remembered itself. "Living Saint!" someone shouted. "Xenoconstruct!" shouted someone else. The Doomslayer reloaded. He walked the streets that had been trenches 5 minutes earlier and made them streets again. Civilians peered from behind saint statues with broken faces. Sisters of battle marked blessings in the air and stepped aside without lowering their bolters. A sergeant in a torn flak coat tried to ask questions and lost the words halfway through. The Doomslayer looked past him, found a shrine gate where the warp was still trying to pry a finger hold, and broke the last claw tip, trying to come through with the flat of his blade. The storm guttered. The sky stopped being a wound and went back to being a very ugly color of gray. 100,000 people learned what it felt like when hope arrived in the wrong shape. 100,000 more would argue later about what, exactly, had just saved them. But the city, a hive whose name had always rhymed with attrition, took its first real breath in months. The man in green did not kneel to the altar of the God Emperor. He did not spit on it either. He nodded once at a wall mural of a golden man carrying a world, as if acknowledging a fellow laborer, and started walking toward the next sound of trouble. They didn't arrest him so much as accrete around him, the way frost grows on a window. First came the survivors who had rank, then the ones who had authority, then the ones who claimed God's authority, and then the ones who showed sigils that made the others forget which authority they'd had. Rosettes flashed, and servo skulls buzzed in ammoniac halos. The Ordo Malleus spoke a litany of rites, the way tech priests chant warming cycles, and the Doomslayer answered by existing. Hexagrammic shackles that had held screaming witch things closed easily around his wrists, and then did nothing. They checked them twice. They checked him 3 times. He let them. The scholar indoctrinated confessed over him. The ministorum sprinkled oils that smelled like melted incense. The Adeptus Mechanicus arrived in a block of red and chrome, brought a portable altar to the motive force and a cliff's worth of auspex. They wheeled out boxy sensor limbs that clicked at his armor and pinged off it like rain. Machine spirits inside the analyzers keened. Transmission logs later would show strings of Binharic blasphemy. Unknown pattern. Unnamed principle. Sanction request denied by fear. His weapons were catalogued without names. A double-barreled relic that shouldn't have fit in a human frame. A crimson blade that existed in graphs rather than diagrams. A launcher that insisted mass and light had an arrangement. A gun that every servo skull in the room tried not to look at. He didn't speak. When the interrogator asked him for his name, he looked at the door as if that were the answer. When a confessor demanded creed, he looked at the next portal sigil painted on a bulkhead map. When a tech priest offered the catechism of maintenance, he let him get to the line about appease the spirit with purity seals, before walking to the nearest armory rack and checking the quality of the shells with his thumb. The cogboys kept talking anyway. They patched his plate with prayer-stamped ceramite, embedded micro-teleport coils into his gorget, the best they could coax from ancient STC whispers, and argued about whether the green armor was a god. Someone tried to measure the rage in him with a cyocularum, and went to the medici with a nosebleed that looked like a confession had been torn out the hard way. The Grey Knights made their entrance as polite gravity. Silver plate, warding runes that changed language when you blinked, the easy stride of beings that assumed they were happening to the room rather than in it. They did not bow or sneer. They assessed. They requested a trial by deed inside a sanctum lined with iron and scripture. The Inquisitor agreed. The Mechanicus asked for data feedback. The Doomslayer loaded his shotgun. They opened the gate on a contained manifestation, a prince of the lesser horrors, laureled by a choir of mortal psychers on drip-fed narcotics to keep the rift's throat open. Scripture flamed on the walls. Chanting hit the echoes like nails. The demon had names enough to buy itself a city. It shouted 3 before the Doomslayer crossed the room. Its first gift was a net of thought. It hit him like winter hits glass. The glass did not break. He answered the net with motion, and the motion with intent. Stagger with a blast, step through the reach, break the mind anchor with a shot to the sigil, knee to the joint that evolution had never intended for bearing weight in this plane, and crucible down in a line that wrote no more across a paragraph of evil. When the thing died, not retreated, the librarian watching from behind the field wards made the sign of the Aquila without irony. A paladin murmured the word weapon, as if it were a rank. The Inquisitor lowered a rosette with a face that could have been a prayer in stone. The Mechanicus printed graphs at each other. They tried conversation one more time, because this is how empires justify a decision, with minutes that can be filed. The Ordo asked whether he would go where the eye opens. He looked at the hololithic map and pointed once. The meaning was clear even to bureaucrats. There. The Mechanicus asked whether his arms required unguents or song. He pointed at ammunition. The Grey Knights asked whether he could be recalled from a bad rift with a beacon. He accepted a rune-etched device about the size of a clenched fist, clipped it to his belt, and tapped it twice to satisfy the ritual of acknowledgement. An arrangement crystallized out of the vapor of panic and awe. He would not be documented as an asset. He would be whispered as a rumor. The Inquisition would cut him corridors through red tape and open doors others had only ever knelt before. Ministorum liaisons would learn to shut their mouths and open reliquaries filled with sanctified shells. Forge worlds would fabricate munitions to his tolerances and pretend they hadn't. A teleport homing device, keyed to chambers the Ordo kept for emergencies that were gifts, would let him fall on his targets like a hammer that had skipped the swing and appeared at the impact. They did not bind him with oaths. Oaths require words. Instead, they offered him war. That at least was a language he understood. He signaled readiness by walking toward the portal dais, the micro-teleport coils in his armor, humming like the throat of a predator that hasn't eaten in too long. Priests muttered, tech priests clicked, knights saluted silently with their eyes. The room lightened as if it knew something terrible was about to happen somewhere else. He vanished into the light without ceremony, and the Imperium, which survives by turning anything into a function, wrote a new function in the margins of its most secret book. Deploy the Green Saint when the wound will not close. Chaos is not a single eye, but a sky of them, and for a long moment, all of them looked the same way. The first rumors arrived in the warp as taste. Copper on a red tongue, ozone curling like a question mark, the ghost flavor of stubbornness. Horn was the first to laugh, a short, delighted bellows that blew whole mountains of skulls into avalanches. "A skull that won't die!" the brass hosts roared back to him. Tzinch didn't laugh. He blinked sideways and filled a dozen crystal libraries with footnotes about a foreign energy that refused categorization. Nurgle patted a cauldron, cooing to his flies that there was a new child to nurse into belonging. Slaanesh spread a mirror across a horizon and invited it to find a flaw. Word trickled down the ladder of nightmares to mortal cults and up the rungs of ambition to greater demons. There is a hunter loose in the meat realm who does not pray, does not beg, does not bargain. He merely arrives. The first concerted answer was theatrical, because Khorne believes in making points with architecture. On a demon world hung like a trophy in the eye, brass citadels were stacked on burned bones. A gate the size of a void ship's prow unhinged itself, and the Doomslayer stepped directly onto a causeway of serrated iron. They rang the war drums until the air turned jagged. 2 bloodthirsters took wing to flank, a host of bloodletters arrayed with geometric obedience, their blades forming a red equation with only one solution: blood. The Doomslayer shouldered the BFG as if he were adjusting a coat, drew a circle with its mouth, and made a hole through reality that ate lines of lesser demons as if the world had yawned. The bloodthirsters hit like planets collide. He didn't meet force with force. He moved just outside of it, using shockwaves like elevators, using the slap of pressure to sling himself to the head of a halberd swing. One horned skull met his gauntlet and lost, shattering into a jag of brass that he used as a climbing pick to haul himself along the demon's arm. The crucible bit, and the furnace inside the thing flared a color the warp didn't own. Khorne's laughter cut off in surprise when the first greater demon ended without the polite retreat of banishment. The second one learned and tried to drown him in whip and range. He used the whip's own drag to rebound onto its back and wrote refusal down its spine. The host broke. The Doomslayer walked uninvited across brazen bridges as the towers fell away like sulking idols. From the eye's edge, a crown of iron teeth ground together in thought. Tzeentch replied with geometry and time, his favorite form of contempt. The Doomslayer was lured to a world that had once been a shrine to prophecy and was now an optical trap. Staircases by the thousand led nowhere. Doors became windows, and windows became oceans. A lord of change stepped out of a fog of equations and said a word that tried to rearrange the Doomslayer's childhood and replace it with a myth. He answered with a grenade. The sorcerer's laugh had 4 notes and a hesitation. That hesitation was where the super shotgun went. Psyker covens layered the field with mind nets, thoughts braided and hurled like weighted ropes, logic knots designed to snare reflexes. The first net slowed him a heartbeat. That was enough to teach him the rhythm. He began to hear it, the way the warp exerted pressure like tides, the way intent gathered like static at the corners of rooms. He tilted his violence into the lulls the same way a diver reads a wave. The Lord of Change multiplied into 9, then 81, then an insult of reflections. He tagged the real one by noticing which shadow didn't care about the light source and cut the bird's book in half. Letters fled like insects in sunlight. He pinned the demon to its own prophecy with the crucible, nailed its name to the floor, and the name went quiet, like a word forgotten mid-sentence by the universe itself. Nurgle took longer, because patience is his hobby. A manufactorum moon failed and flowered into a garden of rust. Vines of corroded chain sprouted, dripping sweet pus into open engines. The air was thick with lullabies that sounded like humid summers and forgiveness. The Doomslayer's armor recorded a rise in particulate. He recorded nothing. Plague-bearers marched with contented groans, counting to diseases that didn't exist yesterday. A great unclean one lumbered forward, ladling contagion from its belly crater the way a grandmother serves soup. It offered adoption with a hug that could house a cathedral. He answered by jumping straight into the hug and using the nauseating gravity of it to get close enough to put a rocket into the demon's laughing tonsils. The blast rattled fly chimes. The giant smiled anyway and patted him with a hand that should have put a man into gentle, terminal fever. The gifts slid off him. Blessings turned to sludge on his greaves. Where rot reached for him, heat answered. Where spores probed, they found something like a furnace with no vents. It wasn't a ward or a prayer. It was refusal so absolute it became physics. He waded through the garden, ruining it, making straight lines where growth had demanded curves. He took a plague banner and used it as a club. He carved a trench across the unclean one's belly until the personal cauldron that had cooked 100 worlds spilled its contents into vacuum, where those contents learned how to be nothing. Nurgle, watching from his cottage wider than time, sighed, not in sorrow, but in interest. "Stubborn little darling," he said fondly, and set 3 new plagues to toddle toward that strange flame. None of them survived the first breath of the BFG. Slaanesh tried last, and with artistry. No battle, just a room. He stepped through a door in a hab spire, echoing with panicked prayers, and found an impossible amphitheater of velvet and pearl. The air tasted like every victory lap anyone ever earned. The lights played off polished stone in a way that made every edge kind. A woman with a face borrowed from 100 memoirs offered him a helmet he'd once taken off and refused to put back on. "Rest," she whispered. "You've killed enough for 10 lifetimes. Don't you want one where your hands stop shaking?" He looked down at his hands. They didn't shake. The illusion flickered. The amphitheater blamed the lighting. Then came noise crafted for him. The scream of the first imp that had ever leapt the wrong way. The grind of elevator gears in a UAC facility. The distant cheer of a crowd that doesn't exist. He walked through them as if through wind. Temptation requires purchase, and Slaanesh could not locate a seam. The Keeper of Secrets, sent to curate the exhibit, stepped from the curtains, 1,000 joints arranging themselves like a lie. It brought its blades up in the form of a dancer, making a point. He put a slug through the mask, then kicked the body into a pillar that thought it had been a cloud. When the demon tried to vanish into sensation, he killed the sensation by breaking every fragile, engineered object in the room, until the only feeling left was the certainty of the crucible descending. The mirror he shattered last, because it insisted. Even so, brute force wasn't the only game in town. Chaos adjusted. Mortal war bands hired sanctioned psychers by the bushel and fed them powdered saints' bones to make their visions crisp. Heretic Astartes built labyrinths whose corridors turned around dust motes and whose doors opened into numbered hours that didn't match the clocks they came from. Sorcerers crafted mind nets with redundancies, 3 anchors, 5 tethers, 9 sacrifices, so that even if he broke one, the rest would cinch. The first of those almost worked. A dozen psychers bled themselves into a braided leash that wrapped around his memory and tried to lead him in circles until his rage dulled into habit. Habit is just a rhythm you haven't listened to closely enough. He learned the pulse, crest, trough, the slight drag before the next tug. He started timing reloads to the moment the leash slackened, stepping between thoughts. treating the net like a clumsy fencer to be baited into overreach. He traced the line of force across the floor, found the primary anchor, a boy with a shaved head and a saint's nail in his tongue, and cut the sigil beneath him so cleanly the world didn't notice it had been edited. The leash went slack forever. He did not kill the boy. He broke the brand out of his mouth and left him to the medica with an inquisitorial kill sigil burned into the door so the right people would get there first. Tzeentch retaliated with an hour that wouldn't end. The Doomslayer woke into the same corridor 50 times, fought the same fight, felt the same fatigue, tried to creep like mold into the grooves between action and will. The 51st time, he walked a step faster. The 52nd he fired before the demon opened the door. The 53rd, he didn't blink when the lights flickered. By the 70th, he had trimmed the loop down to a minute and burned the loop's hinges. By the 100th, he found the watchmaker. 3 robed figures sharing one spine, behind a wall that shouldn't have let bullets pass. Bullets don't ask permission when they're told. He broke the hour. Time turned back into moments, which are easier to kill. He began to mark things, not prayers, but data. On the inside of a cathedral's broken bell, he scratched a ring of dents spaced to match warp surges so that the bell itself could tell a guardsman when to shoot. On a grey knight's warding plate, he traced a secondary circuit that would trip when a mind net touched it, so their swords would be in motion before fear could invent a reason not to swing. On his own armor, the Mechanicus had added hexagrammic seals. He supplemented them with lines, arrows, little notches that meant move now, duck later, reload here. From a distance they looked like heresy. Up close, they were a metronome. Names matter to Chaos. He began to treat them like targets. He learned the cadence of a demon's self-introduction, the way pride makes syllables linger, the way boasting opens the throat. He strobed the BFG to stagger, used the crucible like a pen, and wrote the first letter of a denial into the air where the sigil of a name wanted to be. It's difficult to complete a word when the alphabet suddenly disagrees with you. Lesser demons began to panic when they realized they couldn't remember their own boasts. Greater ones found themselves tongue-tied in the instant before a killing stroke. Tragically, the only instant that matters. All the while, he kept refusing gifts. A plague tried to make him ache with the humble nostalgia of illness. He coughed once, and the cough sounded like a vault door closing. A vision promised him the dead would stay dead if he stopped creating more. He stopped moving for exactly the time it took to consider the sentence, then resumed. A cunning warpsmith offered him a chain axe that promised to grow cleverer every time it tasted blood. He left it chewing the floor. He wasn't uninterested in improvement. He let the Mechanicus polish the micro-teleport coils and accepted purity-sealed shells because they worked, but anything that asked him to want was denied at the root. Chaos adapted again by avoiding him. Rifts learned to open 3 blocks away from where his beacon could be placed. Cults split their summoning circles into mobile cadres, each carrying a third of a rite, so he couldn't disrupt all of them at once. Sorcerers layered mortal hostages like insulation around their true objectives, knowing he could be delayed by the necessity of pulling humans out of the path of inevitability. He responded by speeding up the only thing he trusted, his hands. He broke circles as if they were made of habit. He turned rooms meant for humiliation into rooms used for triage. He made the shape of hope in the ugliest hospitals, Not with speeches, but with a corridor you could run through without dying. And always after, the warp shuddered. Khorne paced his throne, amused and annoyed in equal measure. Tzeentch built games with more pieces and fewer rules, and still lost at the move called Now. Nurgle brewed and brewed and brewed and beamed when the brew boiled over, only to find the pot was empty. Slaanesh tuned instruments for a concert that never captured its single audience. They stopped thinking of him as a man and began regarding him as an environmental hazard, a hostile weather pattern in the Materium. They were right. He had learned the weather of them in return. The gusts, the lulls, the barometric drop that comes before a scream. He carried that forecast in the tilt of his head and the set of his shoulders. He read the warp the way other men read a street. And when the storm tried to stare him down, he answered with the only language it couldn't counterfeit. The arrival, the action, the absence of aftermath where a demon should have been, and a name that used to be said out loud and wasn't anymore. Power in this galaxy is usually measured in how much of it you can bring to bear from how far away. The Doomslayer doesn't respect distance. His economy is seconds, not supply lines. The moment he enters a battle space, the metric changes from who holds ground to who survives 10 meters from this man. That's the kill box he drags with him, a moving singularity of consequences where psychotricks, heroic speeches, and ballistic tables collapse into whether your next heartbeat arrives. Against Adeptus Astartes, the translation is brutal but legible. A tactical squad is a self-correcting machine. Overlapping arcs, autosenses, gyrojets that turn cover into decoration. He breaks the machine the way he breaks everything, by removing the piece that presumes time belongs to it. He slides between bolter booms on muscle memory that pretends the rounds have a rhythm, tags the heavy with a stagger from the BFG's low pulse, uses the micro-teleport coils to erase a sight line and reappear behind the one Marine who hasn't decided if he's turning or firing. The super shotgun at under 3 meters is not a gun, it's a verdict. Terminators insist on being a different conversation. He obliges by changing dialect. No frontal argument with storm shields, no long debate with assault cannons. He climbs them, clamps onto a vambrace with the saw, boots on a gorget, and works joints and seals with the intimacy of a tech marine and the manners of a meteor. When the librarian arrives with the obvious solution, stop his mind. The null techniques he has learned are not sigils, but habits. Look away from the glamour. Step into the trough of the mind tide. Break the anchor rune with buckshot, so the thought never finds a place to sit. It isn't pretty. Neither is surviving. Chaos Space Marines are worse in the way seasoned predators are worse. Unpredictability with experience welded on. The Doomslayer respects them the way he respects cliff edges. Noise Marines turn a street into a pressure cooker. He kills the amps first because he knows which sound in a room matters. Plague Marines turn attrition into a hobby. He refuses to subscribe, converting their slow roll into a fast fall by splitting squads and forcing one-on-one exchanges where his refusal to die isn't theological, it's kinetic. Raptors, warp talons, lightning claw aesthetes. He meets them mid-air off a grenade jump and teaches them the floor at speed. Warpsmiths bring demon engines that are half theology, half metallurgy. He solves theology with the crucible and metallurgy with rockets shoved into mouths not designed for honesty. The Adeptus Custodes are not a bigger marine. Their warfare distilled until it tastes like inevitability. Here his advantage narrows to a knife edge. A single custodian can read angles in a room like scripture. The Doomslayer takes away the room. He breaks pillars, drops dust, forces the Golden Warrior to choose between perfect lines and oxygen. Spear meets crucible, Auramite meets unmaking, and for long seconds it's just two absolute answers clashing until an imperfection appears, a misweighed lunge, a fraction of traction lost, and he spends it without hesitation. Against a shield captain, with a blade that remembers triumphs, he does not win clean. He wins like a landslide, ugly, with momentum and gravity and a refusal to stop once the hill starts moving. He never fights the Sisters of Silence. He moves with them. Their null field eats the color out of Psyker battles. In that gray, his heuristics become tyrants. Mind nets fray on the edge of their aura. Demons lose their vowels. The Doomslayer has no superstition about the aura's chill. He plants himself in it like a man stepping under hard rain. Together they make a machine for ending sorcery, a walking, silent answer to the eye's loudest questions. He will not say it, but they are the only allies who make the fight feel easier. Assassins are what the Imperium puts where it can't put regiments. Vindicare angles betray nothing. Calidus lie with chemistry. Colexus walk like migraines. And Eversaw are knives wired to heartbeats. He meets the Vindicar by refusing to stand still long enough to be a math problem. When the shot comes anyway, he has already moved. He knows the patient places on a battlefield and burns them. The Calidus tries to be someone who matters to him. There isn't anyone who matters to him more than the next target. The Eversaw hits like a wasp nest and dies like a bomb. He leaves it a wide room and a short life. The Colexus is a walking silence he doesn't hate. They pass once like storms acknowledging each other and choose different lightning. Scale breaks when you wheel in the gods of steel. Dreadnoughts can be outmaneuvered, their arcs mapped, their feet convinced to step where melter and gravity shake hands. Knights are duels you fight inside architecture. The Doomslayer turns hab blocks into ramparts and stairwells into ambushes, uses verticality and blind spots around carapace guns, cuts a knee actuator, and then treats the fallen noble as a fortress breached from within. Titans are not duels. Titans are mountains that have learned opinions. Here, at last, he reaches the edge of his domain. He can harry. He can cripple void shield projectors with precision shots if he can get above them. He can teleport inside a cathedral of pistons and butcher his way to a plasma heart. He can't fight two at once. He can't fight one in the open with clear fields and supporting armor. The right answer to a warlord titan is a counter-titan or an orbital strike. He is not the right answer to everything, and he behaves better for knowing it. The Xenos spread his report like cautionary tales. Craftworld Aeldari try to simply not be there when he arrives. A Farseer threads futures together like beads until she finds a path where he collides with air. He dirties the future, smoke, debris, random motion, forcing her to calculate in noise. Striking Scorpions learn the hard way that ambush is less a position than a timing. He keeps taking turns out of the deck. Howling Banshees lose their advantage in places where sound dies quickly, and he brings those places with him by shattering balconies and choking courtyards with dust. A Solitaire dances through bullets and regret. He tags the patterns downbeat and fires where the dance has to be if it wants to stay a dance. He doesn't catch them all. That's the thing about elves who think in diagonals. But he catches enough to make them stop calling it elegance and start calling it luck. The Drukhari treat pain as currency and speed as proof of a thesis. Reavers buzz him like hornets. He spines their lanes with frag and counterspeed by turning straightaways into obstacle courses. Incubi make honorifics with claves. He refuses the grammar and kills them while they're still pronouncing their own ranks. A homunculus offers improvements no one should want. He declines and returns the favor by improving the homunculus with a rocket at intimate range. The Tau, by contrast, try to do everything right from a distance. They stack drones like algebra, sweep with marker lights, and let the suits talk. He shortens arguments by appearing where the talk is happening. Crisis suits die like men in armored rooms when a stranger knows their blind corners. Riptides and broadsides don't move fast enough to be safe from someone who kills angles and not hull points, but their supporting net is tight. He takes pain here, and he learns to respect the way they learn. Orcs learn faster than they admit, which is why they still exist. The Doomslayer is a gift to a war boss's ego and a curse to his plans. Chopper mobs pile in with the joy of a single idea. He turns the joy into a funnel, shoving bodies into corridors where numbers matter less. Knobs bring weight. He removes legs. A weird boy tries a trick, and the trick either works gloriously or blows up in a way that makes the greenskins laugh and die and laugh. The wah field makes the bullets behave like stories. He refuses to be a character. He kills the banner first, then the loudest boy, then the boss. If there is still a fight after that, it is no longer the same fight, and even orcs can feel a mood die. Necrons complicate truth. Gauss strips the subject of being from the predicate of existence. He cannot let it touch him. He treats their fire like the edge of the world and moves inside it. Blades scythe in straight lines. He does not. Phase geometry means he can punch a Lich Guard today and have the bruise appear yesterday. He answers by refusing to care what calendar the bruise uses. Resurrection is a problem until he starts carrying a little bag of demolition answers and learns to render the reassembly matrix into confetti. A cryptek rewrites a hall while he is in it. He breaks the stylus. A Satan shard writes itself as a god across a room. The Crucible is an editor with strong opinions. He doesn't unmake a Star Eater. He makes it leave. Tyranids are a pressure test on the concept of enough. The little ones teach him that reloading is a religion. The big ones try to make the little ones' lesson permanent. He shifts from duel to triage, stagger the Carnifex with a BFG pulse, kill the Synapse with a clean Crucible stroke, watch the Gaunts go foggy, and then sweep them before the next node grows a brain. Genestealers demand respect. Too many limbs and enough speed to make a man reconsider a hallway. He uses halls they can't share and corners that kill ambition. A hive tyrant is too much mind for one room, but he has learned to make rooms into rules. He knows where the floor demands a fall. Void War isn't his habitat, but he learns to breathe there. Boarding actions reveal a truth. A void ship is a city that forgot it was a coffin. He moves from bulkhead to bulkhead, mapping pressure, counting doors, ignoring insignia. Void shields laugh at the BFG from the outside. Inside a Mosul, there are places where laughter echoes badly. He puts holes where relays expect prayers and opens hangars to vacuum with a lever that has a skull on it for a reason. He is not a fleet. He is the thing bad fleets expect to happen when they lose attention. He cannot hold a ship against a counterboarding by a full company. That's not a flaw. That's an admission that you can't paint a house with a knife, even if it's the best knife that ever met wood. Then there are the figures the Imperium spells with capital letters, because they are less people than weather systems. A Primarch is not a space marine times 10. He is a proof. Guilliman is logistics with a sword. You don't beat him. You outlast his calendar. Russ is predation with culture. You don't outhunt him in a forest that has agreed to be his. Vulcan is endurance dressed as kindness. You don't break him in rooms that remember warmth. The Doomslayer's answer is to force misunderstandings. He creates environments where their proofs don't solve the problem. Small rooms, unfamiliar geometry, vertical traps, intervals measured in the time it takes to finish a motion rather than a plan. On that knife edge, 10 meters, 3 breaths, 1 mistake, he can take from them what the galaxy can't. The moment they aren't a thesis. Daemon Primarchs rewrite the syllabus. Angron arrives like an answer no one asked the question for. The Doomslayer meets him the way a cliff meets surf. He cannot win in an open field against that much momentum and that many echoes of slaughter. He can make the field smaller, funnels, stairwells, a manufactorum tangle of chain and beam, and play keep close until the crucible can write a line across a chest that deserves the scar. Mortarion fills air with childhoods that smell like rot. The Doomslayer holds his breath longer than men are supposed to, and uses the few clean seconds to break scythes and anchors. Magnus is a puzzle box that solves you back. Here the Sisters of Silence matter, or failing them. A geometry of wards and timing that makes the sorcerer waste syllables on shields that will be gone by the time he wants them. He doesn't slay them like a hero in a ballad. He survives them like a rumor that gets harder to deny the more you repeat it. In between gods and soldiers live the strategies that kill worlds. Artillery grids, orbital fire plans, armored pushes that look like continents taking walks. He cannot outfleet a Lord Admiral, or outscry a Farseer, or outfabricate a Fabricator General. He does not have the patience to be a war. What he has is the cruelty to be a turning point. A battlefield is an algorithm, inputs, outputs, feedback loops. He inserts himself where the loop closes, at the Vox hub that makes orders into action, at the shrine where morale turns into refusal, at the demon gate that is about to make numbers meaningless. He breaks the loop with a physical act that can be diagrammed in chalk and blood. Then he leaves before the machine finds a new shape. He also has limits the Imperium learns to respect. He bleeds. He gets tired in ways that look like anger finding a slower gear. He carries ammunition until he doesn't, and then takes yours until he doesn't, and then breaks skulls with what's left. He can be delayed by hostages, and he chooses to be. He can be baited with a big enough demon if you put it behind enough small enough people. He can be stalled with open ground and overlapping fire, not because he can't cross it, but because he hates wasting seconds on problems sand and math already solved. He's not a commander. When given a Vox, he returns it. He's not a flag. When given a banner, he uses the pole to wedge a door. If you must write it down like a Skolam problem, the scaling looks like this. In rooms where a man can see all the doors without turning his head, he is apex. In alleys and gantries and ship intestines, he is inevitability. In plazas and parade grounds covered by armor and flyers, he is a very dangerous animal who chooses new alleys quickly. In void war, he's a breach more than a battle. Against psychers, he is a hard question whose answer is don't, especially when he walks in a silence that hates you. Against gods, he is a reminder that the universe still contains places where hands matter. What changes, finally, is not just who wins duels, but how other players set the table. Warbands build labyrinths with thicker walls and fewer corridors because he turns corridors into graves. Demon hosts carry backup names written inside their ribs. Farseers hedge their calculus with acts of stupidity because he makes smart plans die stupidly. Forge worlds start putting kill boxes into their schematics the way they put drainage into courtyards. The Inquisition learns to time his arrival to the second a ritual says a syllable it can't take back. Everyone gets more careful. Everyone gets angrier. The galaxy gets louder, trying to drown out the sound he brings with him. The click of a safety, the hum of a coil, the soft chuck of a shell seating in a hot chamber, and the awareness, growing like a bruise, that if he is within 10 meters, the only scale that matters is whether you are still standing at the end of the second you are in. They gave him names the way a hive gives someone directions, quickly, loudly, and wrong. The Ordo called him a relict saint in records that didn't exist, and a deployable denial event in those that did. Pilgrims called him the Green Saint because color is a theology when you're starving. On manufactorum floors, he was the door because doors meant either escape or murder, and he did both to the right things. In the data crypts of a certain Forge world, the notation was more honest. Project Anvil. Outcome: repeatable miracles by application of accelerated cruelty to designated vectors. Practice followed rumor. The Inquisition built corridors out of favors and fear. An Inquisitor lord with a face like a closed book carved a budget line through a dozen sub-departments. Emergency translation facilities. In reality, they were rooms with floor runes that knew his beacon's heartbeat, sidereal clocks that ticked in Bin Harik, and boxes of ammunition stacked like liturgies. The Adeptus Mechanicus blessed micro-teleport frames until their incense ran sweet and wrong. The frames were small enough to bolt into a transport's belly, and ugly enough that tech priests loved them. They took a sanctified power feed and coughed out the sound that meant arrival was no longer a verb. They learned to schedule him the way you schedule eclipses. Vox officers drilled on the phrase, "phase clean in 5, which meant the rift's tide would dip long enough to inject a man who didn't care what the tide wanted. Guard regiments were told to hold for a count of 60, not because 60 mattered, but because 60 seconds was sometimes the distance between the world ending and the world having a story to tell about how it almost ended. He would appear somewhere no one rational would stand, between lines, on altars, in the pocket of space where artillery math has a blind spot, and then the fight would take on a new grammar. The Forge worlds pretended not to reverse engineer anything. They wrote papers with titles like "On the Unprovable Efficacy of Red Spectrum Phase Blades in Unlicensed Demonic Apertures" and "Argent Adjacency, A. Study in Energies that Refuse." They produced a handful of things that worked, and 24 things that got acolytes demoted to bell-ringing duty. The Crucible remained a refusal written as a sword. They did not reproduce that. But the idea traveled. Death cults received chain blades with teeth cut to a catechism that bit warp flesh better than it bit guilt. Boarding shields learned to sprout a copper filigree that hummed at mind nets until they frayed. Some clever Margos built a pocket coil that pulsed a half-breath of stuttering reality, just enough to step sideways out of a sorcerer's syllable. The Grey Knights adopted a stagger beacon that synced to his coil hum. An entire strike force learned to arrive on the same downbeat. The first great proof was a city no strategium wanted to remember. Akmora, a hive that had become a proving ground for whether despair could be taxed. The rift opened in the cathedral district, and stayed open because the cathedral liked the attention. 3 days of failing defenses had taught the invaders the local saints' names, and the defenders that they would die in full knowledge of them. The Doomslayer didn't fall from the sky. He stepped out of a basement boiler room that had forgotten what heat was. A dozen Sisters of Silence extended their aura like a cold sheet over scalding water. The vox crackle changed from prayer to numbers. He broke the main circle the way a city butcher breaks the spine of a pig, one motion with practice, and turned to a secondary that wasn't on any map. He was already in motion when the hidden cutouts in the transept floor slid back and unleashed things that screamed in 3 directions at once. He tagged the rhythm, shot the anchor, handed a sister a nod like permission, and moved on. Akmora branded the method, cut the throat of the ritual first, then everything that thinks it is a throat. You could hear the fight's temperature drop. Priests who had preached at the sky found themselves herding civilians to cover with a hand on a child's crown, and the other on a heavy stubber they had not fired since novitiate. Guardsmen loaded methodically, because panic couldn't compete with a map where the next corridor was clear for at least 15 meters. Demons died in the peculiar silence that happens when a choir of the elect stops talking because there is nothing left to say. The city's bell rang a note so steady you could set a metronome to it. By the time the vigilant gunships peered down through ash and rain, there were only bodies and a man walking toward a stairwell like time had left something for him at the bottom. In the months that followed, the map of war twisted to accommodate an uncatalogued weight. Portents changed. A Septimus Farseer adjusted her skein and discovered a stubborn strand that refused to be woven, then told the autarch to change his plan by 13 heartbeats and a wall. A Chaos Lord replaced his mortal anchors with servo skulls, because skulls don't cry when you kill them. He was found nailed to his own fighting platform, with a blade that didn't bother to be poetic about it. On Caden's moon, a warpsmith hid his ritual in a maze of industrial catwalks and numbers. A guardsman later wrote in his letter home that a green man made the maze smaller by walking through it, like doors owed him something. The Imperium formalized informality, as it always does. An Ordo Malleus brief named the tactic Door-In, local null support, beacon authentication via triple phrase litany, preloaded ammunition prepared to Argent-tolerant tolerances. The brief warned, do not plan around the asset's speech. It does not speak underlined. If local morale demands a saint's name, give it one you can live with. So he became Saint Unlooked For in a shrine on Brannis, Saint Immediate on a pilgrim liner that had turned its chapel into a bunker, Saint Not For You in a penal legion whose chaplain understood the joke. Politics arrived because nothing succeeds in the Imperium without drawing a crowd of people who intend to claim it. A restrictive conclave proposed custody protocols. They wheeled in an arco-flagellant as an example of controlled ferocity. The Doomslayer looked at the cables and then at the exit. The proposal died in committee, and the Inquisitor backing it stopped waking up on time. A radical tried to weave him into a broader weapon, a hexagrammic subroutine etched into the teleport frame so that the return beacon would bring him to heel. The subroutine burned out on contact with a refusal that didn't understand instructions, and the radical found a purity seal on her desk the next morning, with a single fingerprint pressed into the wax. The fingerprint was not hers. There were failures, and because they were honest, they taught. On Grief's belt, a ring station that had forgotten planets, he arrived into a maze built by a sorcerer who loved numbers more than people. The corridors learned his habits as he moved, and the station used hard vacuum like punctuation. He left frost on a wall where a breath turned to crystals and his gauntlet had to scrape it free. He bled in straight lines where the maze insisted they would be curves. He killed the sorcerer on his third pass through the same room, which had been 2 rooms, which had wanted to be none. He marked his visor with a tiny notch next to a line the Mechanicus later learned to call a "do not trust geometry here" sign. The Mechanicus asked if he would share a set of best practices. He shared nothing, but continued to live, which was education if you paid attention. Forge World Graia fielded the first Argent pattern door breaker, a man-portable device that hummed like a headache and spat a single line of light that erased sigils if you drew slow and straight. It didn't kill. That wasn't the point. It robbed rituals of grammar. Stormtrooper cadres began to carry them the way men carry knives in ugly neighborhoods. Astartes frowned at the aesthetics and adopted them anyway when a librarian said the word useful without adjectives. A chapter serf somewhere edited the prayer for breaching to include, "Let our lines be straight, let our wrists be steady, let the light refuse." In the ecclesiarchy, doctrine bent. Strict saints require miracles with paperwork. What he brought were results without liturgy. This confused priests who loved rules more than people and delighted those who loved people more than rules. A bishop in the Hrax subsector wrote a homily titled "On Providence That Does Not Dress Up" and got away with it because a hive under his care stopped screaming for 6 weeks, and he spent those weeks delivering food instead of sermons. A schism threatened, the Green Sanctists, who wanted statues and rosaries with shell casings attached, but it never quite cracked. The man himself refused to be present at any ceremony. A ceremonialist without a ceremony looks silly. They did more quiet work and fewer loud anointments. Chaos ceased to be surprised. It began to be angry. Tzeentch built kill mazes with auxiliary shadows and trap hours that reset without tells. Slaanesh booby-trapped corridors with triumph. Rooms that gave you what you wanted when you stepped inside them so you would stop moving. Nurgle flooded hospitals with gentle plagues that even Medikis wanted to keep because the first day felt like a soft nap. Horn did the simplest thing. He posted better guards at the gate with weapons that didn't care if it was their day to die. The Doomslayer's answer to all 4 was the same tireless bilingualism. He spoke logistics to the Imperium. More shells, tighter coils, beacon here, and violence to the warp. The second language always carried his accent. Vorgan Rift was a campaign that should have been a summary execution. 9 gates stood in a chain like teeth chewing on a sector's fate. The plan most favored by the High Command involved exterminatus and the weasel words that let men keep their posts after they pressed those buttons. The alternative was drawn on a slate in 5 lines. Cut 1, then 2, then 4 and 3, then everything. They used him as a scalpel to numb fingers. He cut throat after throat and left the dying to the rest of the hand. The Grey Knights came heavy in the wake, warding plates, singing counterpoint to sisters' silences. At the 5th gate, a demon prince of ink and sneer tried to offer him rank. He answered with gravity and a blade. At the 9th, a sorcerer with a book bound in his own future made the mistake of announcing his chosen title before he had earned it. The Doomslayer wrote the denial on the syllable he liked least. Sectors learned to plan differently. Exterminatus rates dipped in charts that no one would ever publish because publishing ruins careers. Instead, you saw more strikes with names that read like sentences. Hold for 1 minute. Silence corridor. 2 doors and a stair. On some worlds, the Inquisition sent nothing but his beacon and a vox with a single channel. The guard found they could hold longer, just knowing that a man might appear and start making adjectives unnecessary. Commissars discovered that discipline stuck better when the miracle wasn't a bolt from heaven, but a boot across a threshold and a job to do. If he brought hope, it wasn't the candlelight kind. It was the kind that sweats. It was guardsmen running shells downstairs because the lift was on fire, and the man in green had already run past. And you didn't want to be the one who didn't keep up. It was a Sister of Silence who had forgotten what smiling felt like, realizing she had a favorite part of the fight again. The moment a mind net snapped, and the room made sense. It was a tech priest who had unlearned the difference between prayer and maintenance, because both kept the coil from stuttering on the wrong second. It was a child who had been hiding under a pew, discovering that the only holy thing she needed right now was a hand that pulled her toward, the door that led to a corridor that led to not dying. There were stories because people need them. A pilgrim on Brannis swore he saw the Green Knight touch the hem of a statue's robe before stepping into a hole in the air. A voidsman on the cruiser. Righteous indifference told anyone who would listen that a man with heavy boots saved their reactor by putting his hand on a lever and refusing to be in the wrong room when it went. A penal legionary in a collar with numbers scratched a mark for each daemon. The stranger killed and ran out of collar before he ran out of marks. An inquisitorial adjutant who had learned better than to believe in anything wrote a letter to her father that ended with, "I saw something that did not explain itself." We lived anyway. The Doom Crusade, no one called it that officially, which is how you know it was the real name, rolled in waves that never got as big as a crusade is supposed to. There were no banners big enough, and no maps clean enough, and no speeches long enough. There were rooms that stopped being rifts. There were days that stopped being endings. There were admirals who started using the phrase "if" instead of "when" in their orders, and chaplains who started telling men to get some sleep because the morning might be survivable. There was a quiet set of ledgers, somewhere in a black library, where a clerk nobody had ever met kept a tally. Worlds not burned, cities not a memory, people not their own last words. It wasn't cleaner. Chaos did not shrink, it specialized. Traps got cleverer and nastier and more personal. Cults learned to wear hostages like armor. Sorcerers layered redundancies on redundancies until the air was a spiderweb of intentions. It turned out that when you make your enemy smarter, you inherit smarter problems. But the human heart is a slow learner with a long attention span. It can be taught to stand up. And it was. You can hear the end of one of these stories from the other side if you listen to floors. A manufactorum's grated catwalk whispers when weight moves fast over it. Sanctified decking hums when coils charge. It hums differently when they charge correctly. Somewhere, a door frame vibrates because a hand hit it on the way past, hard enough to leave skin. Somewhere a bell rings because someone finally told it the truth about time. Somewhere the warp leans in because it thinks there is a show and finds there is a verdict. He never stayed for the epilogue. The city would gather its breath and decide what to call what had just happened. The Order would collect fragments and swear everyone to secrecy, and then tell the story to the exact number of people needed to make it happen again. The Mechanicus would argue in Binharik about whether refusal could be quantified, and a junior would start a quiet cult devoted to lines scratched on armor that make men move at the right moment. Chaos would build a better trap and dream of the day the door opened the wrong way. He would already be somewhere else, in a room designed by someone who adored arrogance, marking the place where the next syllable would try to stand. The sound that followed was always the same, because some noises comfort and some end things. The soft chock of a shell seating in a hot chamber, the coil's hungry hum, the boot that makes the floor tell everyone that time just got shorter. If crossovers are just excuses to throw toys together, this one did something ruder. It changed the shape of the table. A universe that measures strength in fleets and centuries suddenly had to count in seconds and stairwells. A setting that turns hope into paperwork had to entertain the idea that salvation might wear scratched green plate and refuse to fill out forms. Wherever he stepped, the metric of Warhammer 40,000, range, morale, logistics, prophecy, collapsed into a smaller question with sharper teeth. Who survives the next 10 meters? Look at the wake he leaves, and you can read two stories at once. In one, the Imperium, vast, stubborn, allergic to surprises, teaches itself a new reflex. Inquisitors build corridors out of secrets. Magi coax coils to hum on the right heartbeat. Sisters of Silence learn the joy of removing vowels from monsters. They don't tame him. They time him. They make a hole in the machine for a man-shaped refusal and call it strategy. In the other story, chaos blinks, grins, gags, and then grins again. The gods adjust the furniture. Mazes grow thorns. Gifts arrive wrapped in the exact weakness he shouldn't have. Temptations get bespoke. The warp becomes a better liar. And still he arrives, and the lie has to learn past tense. But the grand chessboard is only half the picture. The rest lives lower, under ruined lintels and emergency lights. A guardsman who was born old learns what a calm reload feels like. A novice who thought faith was a speech discovers it's a door held open for strangers. A sister who has outlived her laughter realizes she has a favorite sound again. The brittle snap of a mind net breaking. A Morgos who hasn't called anything beautiful in a century watches a micro-teleport frame tick in perfect cruelty and whispers, "Yes." A child with ash in her hair draws a big green man on the back of a ration box and gives him a smile because she wants to, not because he did. These aren't miracles. They're habits recovered at gunpoint. Violence is a poor teacher of truth, but an excellent instructor in priority. The Doomslayer teaches the galaxy what matters by the way he refuses everything that doesn't. He won't be anyone's mascot. He won't trade names. He won't collect titles like badges. He won't slow down long enough to make a legend comfortable. He just shows up where the rift is worst and makes an absence, and that absence has more use than speeches. It is impolite to both empires and gods that he never explains himself. It is also why he works. And yet the questions we love don't die just because he kills quickly. Does he save the Imperium or sharpen it? Does a hammer this efficient make better carpenters or lazier ones? How many exterminatus orders stay holstered because a beacon hums, and what gets ignored instead? Is he a saint you can't pray to, or a storm you schedule around? If the far future is only war, is a man who ends fights faster a mercy, or an escalation with better boots? Warhammer's great cruelty is that it keeps asking for more. Doom's great cruelty is that it keeps answering now. The overlap between those cruelties is where this what-if lives, violent and strangely hopeful. You can hear his impact in the way stories change tense. Before, shrine worlds fell and were remembered beautifully. After, some are merely ugly and alive. Before, an inquisitor's purity meant clean endings. After, it sometimes looks like dirty corridors that lead somewhere other than last words. Before, a Farseer's elegance carried her through 1,000 branching maybes. After, she budgets for a man who ruins symmetry and still walks out. The timeline doesn't become kinder. It becomes punctuated. Periods slammed down where the warp wanted semicolons. Even in victory, the scale never flatters him into being everything. Titans still stride like arguments no one can win in person. Fleets still erase cities without seeing them. Primarchs still bend battles by existing. He doesn't break the setting. He simply proves there are rooms, even inside this endless engine of misery, where hands matter more than hymns, where seconds are a currency you can spend well, where a single choice made without permission changes the day. When the universe zooms all the way out to infinity, he vanishes. When it zooms back in to 10 meters, he is the whole map. The myths are already misbehaving, as they should. On Brannis, they say he touched the hem of a saint, and the saint let go first. On Caden's moon, they claim he walked through 3 locked doors, because doors are a suggestion to certain kinds of stubborn. On Achmora, there's a bell that won't ring off time anymore, and if you ask why, the sacristan shrugs and points at a line of dents around its inside rim. Tiny, evenly spaced, like a metronome borrowed from a bigger heart. Across a dozen worlds, someone has scratched a little notch on a helmet or a rifle stock that means move now. You can call it heresy. It works like faith, and chaos, bless its malicious honesty, adapts and waits. Khorne polishes a throne and keeps a spot clear for a skull that won't arrive. Tzeentch writes new rules for games he swears he didn't design. Nurgle knits a blanket for a refusal that won't sit still and smiles anyway, grandfather to grandfather. Slaanesh tunes an orchestra for the one audience that won't stay to clap. They have time, so does he. The difference is that he keeps spending it while they plan. So if there's a moral to a scenario this gleefully indecent, it isn't complicated. Put a door where despair thinks there isn't one. Put a pair of hands on the handle. Don't expect thanks. Expect more doors. Expect the work to be ugly, and the outcome to be livable, and the miracle to be a well-timed reload rather than a sky-splitting clean. Expect no speeches. Expect a sound you'll learn to love. The coil's hungry hum, the soft chuck of a shell seating, the way a floor tells every frightened person listening that time just got shorter in the right direction, and then leave the rest to the playground of your head. Where do you drop him next? A Black Crusade spear point to see if Abaddon's 13th finally learns humility. Inside a Necron tomb world before it finishes waking, to edit a calendar with a sword. Onto a Blackstone fortress for a speed run of sacrilege? Into Komorrach to find out if a city made of appetite can choke? Face to face with Guilliman in some airless corridor where honors don't fit through the door? Down in the sump with a pack of Escher and Goliath gangers, because a myth in a trench coat is still a myth. Pick a door. He'll kick it. However you cast it, the joke this what-if plays on two famously humorless settings is the same. In a cosmos that insists on inevitability, a single person's refusal still matters. That's not optimism. That's arithmetic. Seconds add up. Corridors connect. Hands move. A million tiny better choices, forced by one very large, worse choice arriving where it's needed, can rescue a day. Not the world, not the century. The day. For people who have learned to expect nothing, that's a lunatic luxury. So we'll close where we began, with a tear in the air and a mistake in the warp's confidence. Somewhere a bell that forgot its rhythm finds it. Somewhere a priest who loves rules more than people opens a door for a line of strangers and doesn't notice he's changed. Somewhere a commissar puts his bolt pistol away because it won't be necessary today. Somewhere a child draws a green figure and gives it a smile again. And if that's heresy to someone, let it be. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But sometimes war is the sound of a shell seating, a boot crossing a threshold, and a room that will not be a shrine to despair today. If you want more of this madness, you know what to do. Tell me where you'd drop him, who you'd make him fight, which god you'd let try again. Argue in the comments like inquisitors in a quiet room. Like, share, carry the rumor. And the next time a rift opens in your imagination and the galaxy insists it cannot be helped, remember the door, the hum, the chook, the 10 meters that still belong to somebody who refuses. Somewhere in a universe made of endings, a man is already walking toward the next one, and that is as close to hope as some places ever get.